Start with the ending. August 1969, Abbey Road Studios. The four of them are in the building at the same time, recording. This is now unusual. By this point, John communicates with Paul mostly through notes left with their manager. George has already quit once and been talked back in. Ringo quit the year before and came back to find the other three had decorated his drum kit with flowers. They are finishing the end. 2 minutes and 5 seconds. The last song the four of them will ever record together as the Beatles, though none of them will know that for another year. It ends with a drum solo, Ringo's only one on any Beatles record ever. And then John, Paul, and George trading guitar solos in rotation, 4 bars each, back and forth, 6 times. It's the only time they do this on any record. It ends as Abbey Road ends, with Paul singing, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. 2 weeks after this session, John Lennon will tell the other three he wants a divorce. So now go back to the beginning. I want to start with a specific moment and work outward from it. 1979, John is 30 years old. He's just recorded Imagine. He will do press for this album for months, and in almost every interview, he will talk about peace, love, giving up possessions, the brotherhood of man. He will sit at the white piano in the white room and play it for cameras with Yoko beside him. In the same month, he gives an interview to Rolling Stone where he calls Paul's music rubbish, calls McCartney's band a load of shit, calls Wings, which Paul has just formed, a joke. He is not provoked. He volunteers this.
I'm also answering Paul's last album, which mostly because he didn't hand out a lyric sheet. Don't know what he was saying. It starts off with too many people going underground. That was your first mistake. You took your lucky break and broke it in two. Now, if that doesn't mean what it says, I don't know what. Also, the song ends, we believe that we can't be wrong. So I wrote a reciprocal song. And I think that some of the funniest lines on the album are, the biggest thing, whatever it had done was yesterday, and it was actually Klein's line, one line of it, and since you've gone, you're just another day. I think it's the funniest thing I've ever heard. I don't think that about Paul all my life.
This is what people who love the Imagine version of John Lennon tend to paper over. John Lennon was frequently a bastard, casually, almost cheerfully cruel in ways that had nothing to do with being wounded or traumatized or misunderstood. He just enjoyed the knife sometimes, picked it up and used it on whoever was closest and put it back down, and didn't always understand why the other person was bleeding. His son Julian has spoken about this for 50 years. What it was like to grow up with a father who preached universal love and couldn't quite get around to driving to see his actual child. John eventually acknowledged it. He called himself a hypocrite. I'm not the walrus, Paul is the walrus. The self-correction, the admission, buried in a song most people treat as wordplay. The mother thing, Julia, the drunk driver, 17 years old. Yes, that's all real and it matters, but the critic in all of us should be suspicious of how neatly that explains everything. Plenty of people lose parents at 17 and don't spend the next decade occasionally treating people who love them like obstacles. The wound is real. The behavior is also real. They don't cancel each other out. What's more interesting to me is the gap between John's stated values and his actual ones, and how that gap, that exact uncomfortable space, is where his best music lives. Working Class Hero is a song about class resentment and authenticity written by a man who had been wealthy since he was 22 and owned multiple apartments in Manhattan. He knew that. He didn't resolve it. He put the tension on tape and released it and let people argue about whether he was a fraud. Some of them said yes. He didn't particularly disagree.
Don't believe Bible. Don't believe Tarot. Don't believe in Hitler. Don't believe in Jesus.
God, the song, from 1970, is one of the strangest things he ever recorded. He lists verse by verse everything he no longer believes in: the Bible, Hitler, Jesus, Buddha, Kennedy, Elvis, Bob Dylan, the Beatles. His voice is flat, declarative, stripped. At the end he sings, "I just believe in me, Yoko and me." And that's reality. It sounds like a man burning his house down and warming his hands at it. Whether you find that admirable or horrifying probably depends on what you were hoping he would say.
Don't go jumping waterfalls.
Paul. Nobody has ever talked about Paul McCartney's bass playing the way it deserves to be talked about. I keep coming back to this because it's the thing that cracks the whole John is art, Paul is commerce myth right down the middle. The bass playing is not commercial. It's not simple. It's not melodic filler under the important stuff. On Something, George's song, not Paul's. Paul's bass line does something a normal bass player would never think to do. It moves independently. It doesn't follow the chord changes. It anticipates them, goes somewhere slightly different, creates this low-level harmonic argument with everything happening above it. George Martin once said in an interview that Paul's bass parts in the late period were essentially a fifth compositional voice in the band, operating on its own logic. Most listeners have no idea this is happening. That's the point. There's a version of Paul McCartney that is easy to condescend to, the cute Beatle, the melodist, the man who wrote Wonderful Christmas Time and continues to perform it despite knowing better. This version exists. Wonderful Christmas Time is real, and it is bad, and he knows, and he plays it anyway because it makes people happy, and he has made peace with this. But the other version is Paul at 25 in the studio, 2 in the morning, conducting an orchestra for A Day in the Life, with the instruction that they should start at the lowest note on their instrument and end at the highest, and between those 2 points they should play whatever they want. 40 musicians, no shared score. Each one improvising from bottom to top over 24 bars, and the result is one of the most genuinely unhinged sounds ever put on a major label pop record. That was Paul's idea. John's song, Paul's idea. The reason Paul is genuinely hard to write about, and I think this is the actual reason, not the surface one, is that his emotions are not organized in the way we've learned to expect from artists. He doesn't lead with damage. When his mother died, he was 14. His response, as best anyone can reconstruct it from interviews, was to get up the next morning and go to school. Not because he wasn't devastated, because that's what you did. He wrote Let It Be 30 years later, and the Mother Mary in the song is his mother, and it took him 3 decades to get there, and the song doesn't sound like grief. It sounds like someone who has arrived, finally, at something quiet. John would have written the grief at 17 and put it on the debut album. Neither approach is wrong, but they are completely different relationships to pain, and the music they produce is completely different as a result. And the critical history of the Beatles has consistently read John's approach as more authentic, more serious, more worth analyzing. I'm not sure that's right. George Harrison was, by his own account, not particularly interested in the Beatles by the end. He said this in various interviews throughout the 70s. Not cruelly, without much heat. The way you describe a job you used to have that you're glad you left. It was fine. I learned a lot. I wouldn't go back. What he was interested in was Hinduism and Ravi Shankar and his garden in Friar Park, and the concert for Bangladesh, and Formula One racing. He became genuinely obsessed with Formula One, spent considerable time in the paddock, became close friends with multiple drivers. These are not the interests of a man still thinking about She Loves You. The frustration people feel about George is that he seems to have been perfectly happy. He walked away from the biggest band in history and he was fine. He went to his garden. He made records when he felt like it. He attended races. He grew vegetables. He died the way he wanted to die, at home, with Ravi Shankar's son playing outside the room. What people wanted was for him to be angry about it forever, to keep proving the point. Look what I had to put up with. Look what they wouldn't let me do. Because that narrative is more satisfying. It confirms what we believe about creative suppression and delayed justice. George didn't cooperate with that narrative. The one place where you can see the actual shape of his frustration, undisguised, is in the Let It Be sessions. January 1969. They're filming the rehearsals. On the third day, Paul is showing George a guitar part. He's being patient about it, going through it step by step, the way Paul does. George is watching him. And you can see on George's face, it's in the film, you can watch it, this very specific expression that isn't anger exactly. It's closer to the feeling you get when someone explains something to you that you already know and they don't realize you already know it, and you have to decide whether it's worth saying something. He doesn't say anything. He comes back the next morning and quits. His solo album, All Things Must Pass, was released in November 1970. He had been stockpiling songs for years, songs that didn't make Beatles records because there wasn't room, songs that John and Paul passed on, songs he wrote during periods when the band's sessions were so hostile he'd come home and write to decompress. The album is 3 records, 23 songs. The production is enormous. Phil Spector, a 50-piece orchestra on several tracks, a choir. It is, among other things, a document of what was sitting in his back pocket while he was being told he could have 2 songs per album. There's a drumming technique called ghost notes. Very soft, almost inaudible strokes on the snare between the main beats. They don't define the rhythm. They fill the space between the parts that do. If you took them out, the groove would still be there. But it would feel like a room with the furniture removed, technically functional, something missing you couldn't name. Ringo plays ghost notes constantly, and very few people know it. Steve Jordan, who drums for John Mayer and was once Keith Richards' touring drummer, said this in an interview about Ringo. The level of taste he shows in what he doesn't play is more impressive than what he does play. Choosing not to do something in real time while other musicians around you are doing things, that requires more control and more ego management than just playing. Ringo almost never takes the obvious fill. He'll sit in a moment where every other drummer would reach for the crash cymbal, and he just doesn't. He holds it, waits for the moment to pass, plays the room temperature down. Nobody cast him in this role. He wasn't the shy, retiring type. He was, by most accounts, the funniest person in the band, the one most likely to break into a voice or a bit in the middle of a tense session and make everyone laugh before they realized they needed to. He also had the steadiest output of any Beatle, showed up every day, no days when the vibe wasn't right, no philosophical crises about the direction of the work. The other 3 had days when they couldn't be in the same room. Ringo came in, set up, and played. What's strange and underreported is how limited Ringo found the Beatles' studio process, especially late in the band. By 1968, the sessions had become almost entirely about John or Paul's songs, with the others layering parts under them. Ringo would sometimes sit in the studio for hours waiting to record his drum part, which would take 20 minutes, and then go home. He said once that he'd spent more time in the waiting room of Abbey Road than in the actual studio. He came back to the Let It Be sessions after his 2-week absence to find, as I said, that they'd covered his drums in flowers. He didn't have a quote about it. He just sat down and played. That's the thing about Ringo. He doesn't have a grand narrative about himself. He doesn't do the wounded artist retrospective. He has a house and a garden and a peace sign logo, and he goes on tour. Of all 4 of them, he seems the most at home in the life that followed, which may or may not tell you something about the life that preceded it. I've been building to this. The neat version, the one that gets used in every Beatles retrospective, is that they fell apart because of Yoko, or because of Alan Klein, or because of the money, or because of ego. These are all real. They're also a way of assigning blame that lets you feel the story makes sense. The version that actually keeps me up a little is different. They fell apart because the thing that made them work was also the thing that was always going to stop working. John needed to win arguments, Paul needed to be right about the music, George needed to be heard. These needs were in direct competition, and the band survived as long as it did because, for a while, the music was bigger than any of the needs. And then it wasn't. That's it. That's the whole story. The music got complicated, and the sessions got long, and the collaboration turned from something generative into something that had to be managed. And once you're managing a creative partnership, it's already ending. You can see it in Let It Be. Watch Paul try to direct George through a guitar part, and watch George's face. Watch John sitting at the piano and playing the same bar over and over, half checked out, contributing nothing. Watch Ringo play the same 8 bars of a song for the 30th time with the same focused, blank expression because he came here to work, and work is what he's going to do. It's 4 people in a room who used to be able to finish each other's sentences and now can barely start their own. Abbey Road was the last good faith effort. They agreed to finish something properly, together, and they did. The medley on side 2, 8 or 9 song fragments stitched into one long piece, was Paul's idea, and John tolerated it and contributed to it, and the result is genuinely one of the most sustained pieces of composition any of them ever produced. It ends, as I said at the start, with all 4 of them trading guitar solos, 4 bars each, back and forth 6 times. 2 weeks later, John said he wanted out. Not because of Yoko, not because of Klein. Because he was 30 years old and he'd been a Beatle since he was 17, and he wanted to find out what else he was. The others wanted the same thing eventually. George would say later that he felt relieved when it ended. Paul threw himself into work immediately and hasn't stopped since. Ringo went to the pub. 54 years later, if you put on Revolver in a car and leave it, people stop talking. It still does that. Whatever it is, the product of those specific 4 people in that specific collision at that specific moment in history, it still does that. And none of them, alone, ever made anything that did it the same way. John Lennon was killed in December 1980 on the street outside his apartment in New York. He was 40 years old. He'd spent the preceding 5 years mostly at home, raising his son Sean, who was born the same day he turned 35. He had just finished a new album. He was, by multiple accounts, happy. George Harrison died in November 2001 from lung cancer. He was 58. His last months were spent traveling. Los Angeles, Staten Island, which he chose partly because his close friend Ravi Shankar was nearby, and partially because he thought, somewhat reasonably, that he would not be bothered there. He was playing music until close to the end. His last recording has him directing family members through a chant. Paul McCartney is, as of this filming, 82 years old and currently on tour. The tour is called Got Back. He plays Beatles songs every night for 3 hours. Ringo Starr turned 84 this year. He still performs. At every concert, he gets the audience to flash peace signs together on 3. He has done this at every concert for approximately 30 years. He seems to mean it every time. In 2023, the Beatles released Now and Then, a John Lennon demo from the 70s, cleaned up with audio processing, with Paul on bass and guitar and Ringo on drums. George had recorded a guitar part for it in the 90s before he died. It went to number 1 in the UK. John's voice is on it. He sounds young.